Glad that you're here as we're kind of getting things back rolling at the Cove. If you're here, thank you for being here. If you're watching online live, or maybe later on this evening on Facebook or later on during the week, thanks for continuing this conversation that we're having about the kingdom that Jesus came to set up. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount at the same time. Matthew 5, 6, and 7, longest recorded sermon in the Gospels that Jesus preached. And as I said a couple of weeks ago, it never ceases to amaze me about God's timing on this. We plan these like a year in advance. And just like a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about anger, and last week when Elliot was talking about oaths and keeping our word, today you will find it very well timed. We are in a mini-series within this bigger series. We're talking about aspects of the heart, 6 aspects of the heart that reveal the heart that Jesus wants us to have in the kingdom. And these are very deep aspects. Today we're talking about turning the other cheek and walking the second mile. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 41. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now, just like with everything that Jesus says, it's always sometimes taken out of context by people that are promoting their agenda. This verse has been taken out of context to promote the fact that we should all be pacifists. That's not what Jesus was talking about. This verse has been taken out of context to promote that we should be against capital punishment, but that's not what Jesus was talking about. This verse has also been used in an attempt to undermine certain systems of law and justice. That's not what Jesus was talking about. Jesus was talking about us not being retaliatory, us not being vengeful. We often forget that Jesus, in his first century world that he came into, that was a world of extreme injustice. Now, our culture and our society is wrestling with some of that today, but we don't really reflect and remember the injustice that Jesus' world was filled with. There were more slaves of the Roman government than there were actual Roman citizens at that time. And a Roman soldier could actually make a Jewish person carry their load for a mile. And as tradition goes, the young Jewish boys had a mile marked out in every direction from their house so that they would know if a soldier told them that they had to carry their pack, that they would know exactly where that marker was to drop that pack and return back home. And we forget the injustice that Jesus himself endured sometimes. The worst injustice of any single individual in the entire world, the Son of God endured for our benefit. And throughout his life, he didn't say, hey, Pete, James, John, Andrew, we're going to go into Jerusalem and we're going to take over 6 or 7 blocks to prove our point. No, he didn't do that. He didn't go to where the Caesar statues were to tear those down and knock those down because that would fix all the injustice in the world. No, he didn't do that. What Jesus did was he went after the heart, because inside the heart is where the problem lies. Inside the heart, because of sin, is where injustice and all other sins come from. It's because we don't know Jesus. It's that old self. It's that old creation. It's that old life. And Jesus came and he spoke into the newness of life, to give us newness of life so that we would have a new heart that would be freed from all that. And so what he did, he told us to do something that is just uniquely different. He told us when we're wronged to turn the other cheek and walk the second mile. You see, in Jesus' kingdom that he was coming to set up, when the disciples were to respond to something that happened to them, when they were wrong, when something was said against them, when they experienced some type of hate, the way that they were going to respond to that was supposed to be totally different than everyone else in the world. Everyone else is that old self, that old life, that sinful heart, but they were to respond differently. You and I, as the children of the King, are asked to respond differently than people of the world. In the flesh, when we're wronged, what do we want to do? We want to punch back, we want to counterattack, and we want to hit even harder than we got hit. That's the old self. That's the self that doesn't know Jesus' grace. That's the self that doesn't know the power of a transformed heart. That's what we sometimes wrestle with. It's not easy to turn the other cheek. It's not easy to walk a second mile. But in Jesus' kingdom, because he didn't come to set up a political kingdom, he came to set up a spiritual kingdom. He actually came to set up an eternal kingdom. When this world and all the fights and the riots and the crime and the sin and this person's arguing with this person and the right and the left and we just can't agree, when all that is said and done, guess which kingdom will still remain? Jesus' kingdom. So he came to set up a kingdom that surpasses and lasts forever. And so we want to know and look at what this heart is regarding that kingdom. And part of that heart in Jesus' kingdom, he says when you're wronged, he wants you to relinquish your rights. Whoa. Wait just a second. I'm an American. I fight for my rights. I get it. Sometimes we have to fight for our rights. I totally get it. But in Jesus' kingdom, he doesn't want you to always be fighting for your rights. He wants you to do something that is vastly different than that. He wants you to set your rights aside so that you can turn the other cheek and you can walk the second mile so that someone says, why on earth is that person doing that? And then he gets the glory. You see, we just sang a song about the breath in our lungs. You give me the breath in my lungs. What is that supposed to be used for? Is it supposed to be shouting at our neighbor? Is it supposed to be shouting at the left or the right or this person or that person and all the division that we have? No, it is supposed to be bringing praise to our Heavenly Father. And you and I can do that when we have the right heart in the kingdom, and part of that has to do with relinquishing our rights. And here's the example of 4 things. Now, we're not going to get stuck in this area because this is a whole sermon in and of itself, and that's not really where we're going. But I want to give you an example of 4 different things of what Jesus said. The first one has to do with the whole cheek slapping thing. When we're wronged and we get our cheek slapped, Jesus is asking us to relinquish our right to self-worth. In other words, why does Jesus use the whole right cheek thing? Well, most of us are right-handed, and if you're going to get punched by a right-handed person, it's going to be your left cheek that gets hit, not your right cheek, okay? We're not talking about a punch. Even though a punch would hurt more maybe physically, what hurts more emotionally and relationally is a backhand slap, okay? If you've ever been slapped, you know, it just, whoa. And so instead of fighting for this self-image that we have of ourselves, Jesus says, listen, don't fight for your right to have this self-worth thing that's on shaking sand. I want you to give that up, and I want you to turn the other cheek as well. Then he goes into the whole offering a cloak thing, and that has to do, when we're wronged, to relinquish our right to self-preservation. Now, we don't talk about tunics and cloaks all that much. It looks differently in our society than inner garments and outer garments, but it has to do with maybe giving up your job, your time, your talents, your finances, your reputation. Those are the things that we might have to set aside temporarily for the greater good, for what Jesus is wanting to do in the heart of the other person. And then there's the whole walking the second mile thing. That has to do with relinquishing our right to self-determination. You see, when a Jewish boy had to carry a pack of a soldier for the next 5,000 plus feet, he didn't have any way to control his where he was going to go. His destiny, it was going to be whatever that soldier said. And so oftentimes we fight for that determination of, I want to go here and I want to do this and I want to be independent. But Jesus says, listen, when you're wronged, I don't want you to fight for that stuff. I want you to be willing to walk the second mile. And then a 4th area in verse 42, but we didn't read verse 42 because that's a whole nother sermon that's upcoming in a few weeks, has to do with relinquishing our right to self-indulgence. You see, in verse 42, it says, if anyone begs you for something, you give it. If someone has a need and they come and they ask you, you give it to them. You see, instead, oftentimes we just grab as much possessions as we possibly can, and they possess our heart. And Jesus doesn't want that to happen. And so he wants us to use our possessions freely to meet other people's needs. You know how much stuff we have? As Americans, we're so blessed. We go out and get something because we can't find it in the garage, and then eventually find it in the shed, and we got 5 of them. And then we've got no room in the shed, so what do? We go rent, a storage unit, and then, it's got all the extra mattresses and stuff because we didn't get rid of them, and all the other junk that we've got, and we don't even go there anymore, but we know we're overloaded, so we get another storage shed. We just have so much stuff. God doesn't want our heart to be possessed by possessions. And so these are areas that Jesus says, I want you to give up your rights. I want you to relinquish your rights when you are wronged. Now, how many of us find it easy when we're struck on the cheek, when we're insulted, when we're backhanded, to turn the other cheek and just offer the other one up? Now, listen, I've been a Christian since I was the age of 9. I'm not going to tell you exactly how old I am, but I've been in the ministry for 30 years, and it's not easy to turn the other cheek, okay? It's just not easy. Our natural instinct and my natural instinct, when someone slaps me on the cheek, I immediately bow up. I'm gonna have to resist that natural urge to fight back. So it's not easy. How many of us find it easy to walk the second mile when we never wanted to walk the first mile in the first place? It's not easy. What Jesus is asking us is not easy. But what he is telling us and what he's encouraging us to live by is a different standard than the world. And it can make a difference in a world that is hurting and in need of a light, in need of hope. Sometimes what we do is we end up on the wrong side. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, we end up demanding our rights because, after all, we're Americans, and that's what we're supposed to do as Americans. And so we're demanding our rights when what we should have been doing was doing what Jesus asked us the entire time. And there's a reason why Jesus asks us to do these things. And I'll eventually tell you why. But let me explain this whole turning the other cheek. Let me tell you what turning the other cheek is not. Turning the other cheek is not turning a blind eye to injustice. That's not what turning the other cheek means. I know there's injustice going on right there, but I'm just going to turn this way and walk over here and just let that continue. No, that is not what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about turning the other cheek. Nor is turning the other cheek thinking of ourselves as doormats. We're just going to choose to get walked on our whole entire life. That's not what turning the other cheek means. What turning the other cheek means in Jesus' idea of what he's teaching is we don't retaliate. We don't retaliate. We refuse to let that vindictive anger that we talked about 2 weeks ago rule our heart and cause us to sin. We're not going to be like what the world is like. We're going to be different. We're not going to retaliate. Now, I know that revenge and retaliation is very sweet for those who like sin and who like that old self. But I don't like that old self. That old self is nasty. That old self is mean. That old self is filled with sin and rot and corrosion. I don't want anything to do with it. I like the new heart that Jesus gave me. And Jesus wants to give everyone the opportunity to accept and embrace that new heart and become a new creation. Now, that new creation, who I am, our identity as children, our identity as Christ followers is not something that we create for ourselves. It's not something that we build for ourselves and then we spend the rest of our life shoring that identity up. And if we make one big mistake, man, our whole reputation, everything's blown. No, that's not where our identity comes from. Our identity comes from Jesus Christ himself, who has given us that identity, and he maintains us in that identity. He's the one who gives us that right to become a child of God. And because Jesus made us who we are, we can always be who we are no matter what anybody does to us and no matter what anybody's saying about us. We can continue being the Christ follower that he has called us to be. Now, Jesus is not teaching that we have to give up everything to the point of going bankrupt. That's not what Jesus is talking about. That would be taking him out of context as well. He's talking about limits. He didn't tell us you have to walk 20 miles. He said, walk a second mile. He didn't say, when you get sued and you have to give up your tunic, give them your cloak as well. But I also want you to give them your house, your 401k, and your IRA plan. No, he didn't say that. But what he's doing is he's encouraging us to respond with grace, not revenge. And he's telling us that we live by a higher standard than the law and the tooth for tooth and an eye for an eye. Now, you may not understand that. So let me explain what that means, the eye for an eye and the tooth for tooth thing. If we were fighting and arguing and I accidentally lifted my elbow and I knocked your tooth out, you could not demand that my life would be taken from me. It's not proportional, okay? At worst, I would have to allow you to knock a tooth out. A tooth for a tooth. Or if we're, in the garden and we're hoeing and all of a sudden, I throw the hoe and the hoe hits you in the eye and knocks out your vision out of one of your eyes. You can't demand that my life is taken. The worst that can happen is I have to lose sight in one of my eyes. There was a proportionate response. But Jesus is saying, listen, I don't even want you to think about that way. I don't want you to think about an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. I want you to think about grace. I want you to think about mercy. I want you to think about forgiveness. I want you to go that extra mile and turn that other cheek. And you see, going the extra mile and turning the other cheek has nothing really to do. It has so much more to do than just submitting to authority. It has to do with being willing to go above and beyond what any person would think that you would be able to do. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit extended further example out from what's going on in our world today, although there is plenty of examples to use in the last few weeks, but I'm going to use a different one. We've probably all seen in the media at times when a drunk driver has killed a son or a daughter of another family. Horrific, horrific. Now, the world's view of that is I want that person to pay, and I want them to spend the rest of their life in jail, and I don't want them to see the light of day. That's what a life for a life. That's what the world would demand. But we probably have all seen it in the news when that family who has lost that little girl or that little boy says, I forgive that person. I mean, that is powerful. And at times I've had conversations with Susie and I'm like, I hope that if I'm ever in that situation, I pray that I can do that. I pray that I can do that, because what does that do? Does the person deserve to give? Yes. I mean, I could fight for the justice of that. But what does God want? God wants that person, that drunk driver's heart to be changed so that they can experience the transformation that Jesus transformed this other family. He wants their heart and that forgiveness and that grace that is beyond any measure that I can even imagine is what causes a person to break that callousness of that heart and to say, what do you have that I don't have? I want that. That's Jesus is calling to us as his children to respond that way. Now listen, I'm going to ask you a simple question. I want you to think about it before you just automatically raise your hand, because most times I want you to raise your hand, but I really want you to think about this question. How many of you want to be a failure? Okay, I don't see any hands. Okay, you're paying attention. That's really good. If you're online, nobody raised their hand. And I hope that you were paying attention at home and you didn't raise your hand. I didn't even raise my hand as an example. I don't want to be a failure. You don't want to be a failure. But now let's change the question. How many of you want to be successful? I want to be successful. I want to have success in my life. This verse is a key to great success in your life. By implementing this strategy, this principle of the second mile and turning the other cheek. This can change your whole entire life. If you want to be as successful in your job, you're going to have to give double what everybody else gives. If you want to make it to the top and have respect and get to that top position that you want, you're going to have to go the extra mile. You're going to have to turn the other cheek. You're going to have to go beyond the expectations. If you just want to barely survive and hold on so that you're not the last person on the rung that gets fired, if you just want to barely hang on, then just do just enough to get by, and you'll probably survive. But can you imagine in our workplaces as us, children of God, who we lived above and beyond expectations? Can you imagine the testimony that God would build in our places of business if we were all the ones that went above and beyond? We volunteered. We stayed a little later to help the boss. We got in early. We put in a full day's work. We weren't sitting around the water cooler just shooting the breeze for an hour and a half. We took a 30-minute lunch. We took 30 minutes. Can you imagine going above and beyond? Thomas Edison. He was considered a genius, but not by this one particular teacher that sent him home with a note pinned to his shirt that said, "Keep this kid home, he's too dumb to learn." Now, Thomas Edison had over 1,000 inventions given to him and credited to him. Modern technology has been forever changed by many of those inventions. And he was asked, because he was considered later on in life to be a genius. And he was asked, what does it take to be a genius? And he said this: genius is 98%. Y'all don't know. Perspiration. 98% perspiration. You see, what Edison was saying was, listen, it's not the guy who has the most talents, and it's not the guy who's liked the best and most popular and most money and gets a 4.5 GPA and is at the top of his class. No, listen, that's not the genius. The genius is the guy who's willing to just bring everything and do that sweat equity thing and just not give up and be relentless towards what he wants. That's the genius. You see, if you want to make it to the top, do what everybody else doesn't want to do. Keep going that extra mile. This can also work in marriage. Now, I'm not going to talk about the marriages here at the Cove, but over 30 years of full-time ministry, Susie and I we've just seen thousands of couples. And you know what? I hate to say this, but I'm not talking about any couple here. I'm just telling you, most people are miserable. Most couples don't like each other. They're putting up with each other. They're using paper plates instead of dishes. It's toast, not biscuits. They don't remember anniversaries anymore. They don't go the extra mile. Listen, if that's your marriage and you're a Christian, your marriage is supposed to reflect the marriage between Christ and the church. Go the extra mile. Make the other person happy. Do what it was that won their heart to begin with. Don't just do it enough so they don't kick you out of the bedroom or make you sleep in another room or make your own meals and stuff. Go the extra mile. Make them happy. Do what you should do to go the extra mile. And guess what? You'll turn an unhappy marriage into a pleasing marriage, a marriage that honors Christ. But this is also true for the Christian life. You see, outside of salvation, most of the reward, most of being able to live life to the full comes by implementing this principle of the second cheek and the second mile. Think about all the blessing we get by putting into practice what Jesus has asked of us. The secret to a great church, a great Christian life, is the implementation of these principles. Are we a 1-mile church? Or are we a 2-mile church? I would hope that we might even be a 3-mile church. When someone offends the Cove, I hope we're got a little bit thicker skin than just one cheek. I hope we remember who we are. It's the secret to being a great church and a great Christian. Can you imagine what God would do if all of us as his children put in that extra effort? Can you just imagine what our lives would be like just by going the extra mile and turning the other cheek? Question is, are you a 1-mile Christian? Are you a 1-cheek Christian? See, it doesn't matter what people claim about you. That doesn't reveal who you are. Every single person in this room has had something bad said about them at one particular time or another. And if not, you've been living in your house way too long, more beyond than just these last 10 weeks. Every single one of us has had something said about that wasn't true. That was mean and nasty and ugly. But you know what? That doesn't reveal who we are. But how we respond to that reveals our character. Don't reveal the wrong side of that character. So I ask you this as we close. What's this all for? Why do I have to turn the other cheek? Why do I have to go the extra mile? Why do this? Because Jesus wants to transform the other heart. Jesus wants to give a heart transplant to the person who's ripping you, who's hitting you, who's insulting you, who's making you feel bad, who's doing all these things. He wants to transform that heart. That's why we turn the other cheek. Not like this, okay? That's not what we're talking about. Speak to the behind. No, that's not the cheeks that we're talking about, okay? But to walk that second mile gives Jesus the opportunity to say, you know what? You get it. Because you know what? The worst of sinners, I can transform their heart. You see, I'll raise my hand to be in the worst of sinners. And he transformed my heart. He made me different. The worst of sinners. I mean, if I laid out the sins that I've committed, you'd be like, man, we need to have Brandon start preaching. You know, I'm proof that God can do it. So who am I when someone insults? Who am I? Even though my first initial reaction is, to put them down. Who am I to put that person down when Jesus could be using it as an opportunity in that person's life to do exactly the same thing that he did for me? You see, if Jesus was worried about a political kingdom, maybe he would have pulled down the statues and held the signs, but he wasn't. He wasn't interested in that. He was interested in an eternal kingdom. Let me ask you this. Why is it that as human beings, we always have to have another human being that we're fighting with? What's wrong with us? It's almost like we have forgotten what Paul said, that our battle's not with flesh and blood. It's against the principalities, the rulers of the dark world. You see, my battle is not with soldiers during the Vietnam War. My battle was not with them. My battle's not with law enforcement officers now. Our battle's not with black and white and Republican and Democrat and left and right and blah, 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 blah. Our battle's not with each other. Our battle's with Satan, who's sitting back just laughing at us, who absolutely loves what we're doing to one another. Instead, we need Christians who stand up and say, listen, it's not about all that. It's about Jesus wanting to get and change your heart. There's sin in my heart. There's sin in your heart. That's what's causing us to fight with one another. That's what's causing us to say things that are really stupid right now. Just really dumb. Because we're off the message. We're off track. Christian, don't get off track. Now's the perfect opportunity to tell the truth. To say what Jesus Christ came to say to the world when he spread out his arms and he said, it is finished. The battle's over. And guess what? 3 days later, he came out and said, I won. I won. He needs Christians that are willing to reveal the heart in the kingdom. Don't get off message. I know it's easy to do. Don't get off message. There's plenty of opportunity out in the world that we live in to share Jesus Christ and the hope that we have with the world around us. Let's pray.